Get out of my house." Mark Reynolds pointed at the front door, his voice cutting through the storm like a blade. "Tonight. Now. Pack your bag and disappear." Sarah Whitmore didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply looked at her husband of 7 years and nodded. What Mark didn't know in that moment, what he couldn't possibly have imagined in all his arrogance, was that he had just ordered the owner of a $12 million mansion to leave her own home. And he had signed his own destruction with 3 words. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart pounding, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand how a man loses everything in a single night, you have to understand how completely he believed he owned it all. Mark Reynolds was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately calculated his worth relative to everyone else in it. He did it at dinner parties. He did it in conference rooms. He did it at his own kitchen table, looking across at his wife Sarah on a Tuesday morning and thinking, she doesn't belong in my story anymore. That thought had been growing for months. Quiet at first, like a weed under the floorboards, then louder, then impossible to ignore. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand the night Mark Reynolds told his wife to get out, you have to understand the man he believed he was, and more importantly, the man he had decided he was becoming. Mark grew up in Rockford, Illinois, in a house where money was always discussed in whispers and absences. His father worked double shifts at a manufacturing plant and still came home smelling like failure in Mark's young estimation. His mother clipped coupons at the kitchen table with the focused desperation of a woman who knew exactly how thin the margin was. They were not poor in the way that makes the evening news. They were poor in the quiet, grinding way that shapes a child's entire psychology. The way that makes a boy decide somewhere around age 12 that he will never, ever be like this. So Mark Reynolds built himself. Piece by piece, decade by decade, scholarship by scholarship. He was brilliant. Nobody could take that from him. He got through Northwestern on academic merit, worked internships with the ferocity of a man escaping a burning building. And by 32, he had landed at Hargrove Capital Management, one of Chicago's most prestigious wealth management firms. By 37, he was a senior portfolio manager. By 39, the age at which our story begins, he had just been handed the largest promotion of his career, executive vice president, with a compensation package that crossed $400,000 annually. $400,000. He said the number to himself in the mirror sometimes, not out of vanity or not entirely out of vanity, partly out of disbelief, partly as proof. Look at this, Dad. Look at what I made from nothing. The problem with men who build themselves from scratch is that they often develop an accounting system for everything and everyone in their lives. Mark Reynolds had, without fully realizing it, begun running a ledger on his marriage. Sarah Whitmore Reynolds did not, in Mark's private accounting, balance the books. He had met her 8 years ago at a charity auction, one of those elegant Lakeshore Drive events, where the champagne is better than the conversation, and everyone is performing a version of themselves they've been rehearsing since business school. Sarah had been standing slightly apart from the crowd, holding a glass of sparkling water, wearing a simple navy dress that had no business being at that party. No jewelry except small pearl earrings, no performance. Mark had been drawn to her immediately, which confused him even then because she was the opposite of everything he was chasing. She was quiet in rooms that demanded loudness. She was understated in spaces built for display. She laughed at things other people in their circle didn't bother to find funny. She asked questions that weren't about status or achievement. She had this way of listening fully, completely, that made you feel like the most important person in the world, not because she was flattering you, but because she was genuinely interested. He fell in love with her, the way cautious men fall in love slowly, then completely, then with the slightly terrified feeling of a man who is committed to something before fully understanding the terms. They married the following year, and almost immediately after the wedding, they moved into the Lake Forest mansion. This is where Mark's accounting had always contained a critical error, one he had never bothered to audit. The mansion on Lakeview Drive in Lake Forest was spectacular by any measure. 12,000 square feet of crafted elegance set on 3 acres of manicured grounds that rolled down toward Lake Michigan. 6 bedrooms, a library with original mahogany bookshelves, a wine cellar that could have belonged to a small European hotel, and a kitchen that a professional chef would not have found insufficient. The kind of house that made people slow their cars in front of it. Mark had always assumed that the arrangement was straightforward. Sarah had family money. Old money, the quiet kind, that doesn't announce itself. The house was being held through some family trust situation she had explained early in their relationship, but they would live there and he would contribute to the operating costs. A maintenance figure. Modest by the home's standards. A number that made Mark feel like he was carrying his share. He had never asked for the paperwork. Why would he? He was a successful man with a successful income. The house was his home. He made it his kingdom. He hosted firm dinners there, brought colleagues and clients through the grand foyer, let people admire the lake view from the back terrace, and accepted their compliments with the casual grace of a man to whom such things were simply the natural order. He had never not once in 7 years asked whose name is on the deed. A man who believes he is the most important person in every room rarely stops to verify the architecture of the room itself. Sarah, for her part, never corrected the impression. She was not hiding anything maliciously. The information was simply never requested. And she was not the sort of woman who volunteered her financial history in order to calibrate how people treated her. She had learned young that the moment you announce your wealth, you stop being able to trust what you see in people's eyes. So she said nothing. And Mark assumed, and the assumption became the foundation of his identity. Now, the year before this story ends in that stormy confrontation, something shifted in Mark Reynolds. Something that had been building quietly revealed itself in the form of Victoria Lane. Victoria Lane joined Hargrove Capital as a senior analyst 18 months before the night of the storm. She was 31, ferociously ambitious, and she had the particular gift of identifying what a powerful man wanted to hear and delivering it with surgical precision, dressed as admiration. She first appeared in Mark's orbit during a strategic planning meeting. He had presented a portfolio restructuring concept he'd been developing for months, aggressive, sophisticated, the kind of move that separates the executives who read reports from the ones who write the future. After the meeting, Victoria had stayed behind. "That was exceptional," she said. "Not the way people say it to be polite. The way a predator says it when it recognizes something it wants." "Thank you," Mark said, gathering his materials. "I mean it. The risk-adjusted framing on the emerging market exposure, most people in that room didn't fully understand what you were proposing." "I did." He looked at her then, really looked. "You followed the derivatives logic?" he asked. "I followed all of it," she said. "Where did you study?" "That was the beginning." It is important to understand something about men like Mark Reynolds. When they meet women like Victoria Lane, it is not always or even primarily about physical attraction. It is about being seen. It is about finding someone who reflects back the version of yourself you have been working toward your whole life. Victoria looked at Mark and saw the titan he believed he was. Sarah looked at Mark and saw the man he actually was, which was both more and less than the titan. He started staying late at the office. At first for legitimate reasons, then for reasons that were harder to define and easier not to examine. Victoria was always there, sharp, engaged, perfectly calibrated. "You deserve more than you're settling for," she told him one evening in November when they were alone in the conference room with takeout and spreadsheets. It was presented as a statement about his career trajectory at the firm, but they both understood it wasn't entirely about his career. "I'm not settling," he said. She tilted her head. "The house, the wife, the routine. Mark, you've outgrown all of it. You know you have." "Sarah is—" "I'm sure she's a perfectly nice woman," Victoria said with the particular dismissiveness that wraps cruelty in reasonableness. "But nice isn't what you need anymore. Nice is what you needed when you were still building. You've built Mark. You've arrived. Don't you think you deserve someone who can stand in that house and actually match what it represents?" Mark didn't answer, but he didn't argue either, and that silence was the turning point. Over the next several months, the distance between Mark and Sarah quietly transformed from a gap into a gulf. He stopped coming home for dinner without calling. He stopped asking about her week. He stopped noticing the small things she did, the fresh flowers she arranged in the entryway, the books she left on his nightstand that she thought he might enjoy the way she always made sure his favorite coffee was stocked, even though she didn't drink it herself. He stopped seeing her. Sarah noticed. Of course she did. She was not a naive woman. She was deeply perceptive, and she had been watching her marriage change the way a careful gardener watches a plant that has stopped responding to water with attention, with patience, and with a quiet, deepening sorrow. She tried in the careful way that private people try. She suggested they take a trip to Portugal. They had always talked about Portugal. He said he was too busy. She planned a dinner at home, the kind they used to have early in their marriage, when everything was still easy. He canceled an hour before with a text message. She asked him once, directly sitting across from him in the kitchen after midnight when he had just come home, "Mark, what's happening to us?" He looked at her across the kitchen island and said, "I don't know what you mean." It was the most devastating lie a person can tell, not because it was vicious, but because it was chosen. He knew exactly what she meant. "Yes, you do," she said quietly. He walked away. That was 3 months before the storm. In those 3 months, Victoria Lane had moved from implication to action. She and Mark were not yet, as he would have carefully described it, involved. But the emotional boundary had been comprehensively crossed, and they both knew that the physical boundary was a formality at this point, waiting only for Mark to officially release himself from his marriage. He began to think about his life in terms of a renovation project, tear out the old structure, start fresh, keep the good parts, the house, the career, the status, and replace what wasn't working. Sarah, in this architectural metaphor, had been classified as a load-bearing wall he had decided was actually non-essential. He talked to no one about this plan. Not his friends, the few real ones he had. Not his colleague James, who had known him for 12 years and would have said something inconvenient. He talked to Victoria, who reflected his plan back at him as though it were courage rather than selfishness. "You're not being cruel," she told him. "You're being honest, finally honest. There's a difference. She hasn't done anything wrong," Mark said, once the last remaining honest corner of himself speaking up. "No," Victoria agreed. "But you've grown past her. That's not her fault. It's not yours either. It's just where you are." He chose to believe that. The week before the storm, Mark had lunch with Daniel Howe, a partner at a family law firm that 2 of his colleagues had used for divorces. He did not hire Daniel. He simply asked questions, consulted, gathered information like a general who has already decided to go to war but wants to review the terrain first. Daniel asked about assets. Mark described the house, described his salary, described what he understood to be the financial picture. Daniel asked, careful and professional, "And the property in Lake Forest, is that in joint names or is there a trust structure?" "There's a family trust," Mark said with the confidence of a man who has not verified this. "But we've been there 7 years. I've been contributing to the costs the whole time." Daniel nodded, wrote something down, said he would need to look at the actual documents before they could discuss asset structure. Mark said he would pull them together. He never did. Because in his mind, in the gleaming certain architecture of his ego, he already knew the answer. He had been the man of that house for 7 years. He had walked those rooms with the authority of ownership. He had been the one with the salary, the position, the presence. Of course he was the owner. Some assumptions are so comfortable they become load-bearing in themselves. The night of the storm arrived on a Tuesday in March. Mark came home at 9:30 in the evening. He had been with Victoria dinner, a long conversation that had ended with her looking at him and saying simply and directly, "How long are you going to wait?" He had driven home through the beginning of the storm with his decision already made. Not impulsive or not entirely. It had been building for months. Tonight was simply the night it became a sentence. Sarah was in the library when he walked in. She had a book in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. She looked up when he entered with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something she can feel coming and hasn't been able to name. He didn't sit down. "I want to talk to you," he said. "Okay," she said. "I want you to listen, and I don't want it to become a scene." Something moved through her eyes. Not fear, not anger. Something more composed than either. "All right," she said. He stood in the center of the library. His library, he was thinking, and said it. "I want a divorce. I've wanted it for some time. I haven't said it because I kept thinking it would resolve itself, but it won't. We want different things. We're in different places. I think we have been for a long time." Sarah set her book down very carefully on the arm of the chair. "Different places," she repeated. "Yes. Can I ask you something?" "Sarah, I'm not making a scene. Can I ask you one thing?" A pause. "Fine. Is there someone else?" The question landed in the room like a stone into still water. "That's not the point," he said. And that was when Sarah Whitmore looked at her husband for a long moment, 7 years of marriage, 8 years of knowing him compressed into 5 seconds of absolute silence, and understood everything. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay. I'll need you to make arrangements to leave." It wasn't a question. "The house, I mean, given the situation, it makes more sense for me to go." Still not a question. Statement, clean and complete. "I know it's tonight," she asked. He faltered, just slightly. "I think it's cleaner." Sarah stood up. She was wearing a gray cardigan and dark trousers, simple as always, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman who has just seen something confirmed that she has been quietly suspecting for months. Not devastation, not rage, something far more unsettling clarity. "Then I'll go tonight," she said. "Sarah, you can take time to—" "No," she said. "If tonight is what you need, then tonight." She walked past him without touching him. He heard her footsteps on the staircase, measured unhurried, and stood in the library of the $12 million mansion he believed was his kingdom, listening to his wife pack a single suitcase above his head. It took her 22 minutes. She came back down with a bag that was not even full. She had taken clothing, her personal documents, her grandmother's watch, and almost nothing else. The house was full of things. She took almost none of them. She stopped in the entrance hall and looked back at him once. "I hope," she said with a composure that would haunt him for the rest of the year, "that you find what you're looking for, Mark." He opened the front door. The storm hit them both cold, lashing, mid-March Chicago fury. She walked into it without flinching. He closed the door. He stood in the entrance hall of the $12 million mansion listening to the rain and felt the one thing he had not expected to feel in that moment. Not relief, not freedom. Something colder. Something that wouldn't have a name for him until the following morning when a car he didn't recognize pulled into the driveway at 8:45 and a man in a gray suit with a briefcase walked to the front door and rang the bell with the calm, unhurried manner of someone who is right on time. He would learn the man's name in approximately 30 seconds. Daniel Cross. And Daniel Cross would tell him something that would restructure every assumption Mark Reynolds had ever made about the ground beneath his feet. But that story, that devastating, irrefutable unraveling, that comes next. What city are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what happens next morning changes everything. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, but Mark hadn't slept. He had spent the night in the master bedroom, his bedroom, he kept reminding himself, cycling through the same sequence of emotions that men in his position always cycle through after making a decision they've been building toward for months. First, the clean, airy sensation of having finally done it, the relief of action after paralysis. Then sometime around 2 a.m, something quieter, a stillness that wasn't peace, more like the silence after a door closes in a house that used to have noise in it. He got up at 6, made his own coffee. Sarah had always been the one who made the coffee first, a fact that presented itself to him in the kitchen with unexpected force. He stood at the counter in the gray morning light, drinking it black because he couldn't remember where the sugar was kept, and told himself this was fine. This was the beginning. New chapters always felt strange at the start. By 7, he had showered, dressed, and was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop, reviewing the morning markets with the disciplined focus of a man who uses work as architecture, a structure to stand inside when everything else feels without walls. He sent Victoria a message at 7:15. Just 4 words. It's done. She's gone. The response came back in under a minute. A single line that managed to feel both warm and perfectly calibrated the way everything Victoria did felt. I'm proud of you. Dinner tonight, he typed back. Yes, he felt in that moment like a man who has bet everything on a hand and watched the cards fall in his favor. Clean, decided, forward. The doorbell rang at 8:47. He wasn't expecting anyone. He frowned, set down his coffee, and walked to the front door with the mild irritation of a man whose morning routine has been interrupted. The man standing on the front step was somewhere in his late 40s, with the kind of face that has learned over decades to communicate almost nothing. Gray suit, well-fitted, leather briefcase, a posture that said, "I have done this before many times, and I am not in a hurry, and you are not going to rattle me." "Mr. Reynolds?" the man said. "Yes." "My name is Daniel Cross. I'm a corporate attorney. I'm here on behalf of Sarah Whitmore." He paused, and in that pause, something about the way he said Sarah's name, her full name Whitmore, not Reynolds, registered somewhere below Mark's conscious attention, like a note played in a register you feel before you hear. "May I come in?" Mark stepped back without fully deciding to. What is this about? Daniel Cross walked into the entrance hall with the measured stride of a man entering a space he has every right to enter. He set his briefcase on the hall table, Mark's hall table in Mark's house, and opened it with the practiced efficiency of someone who knows exactly which documents are on top. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, "I need to inform you of several things this morning, and I'd encourage you to hear them completely before responding. Is that agreeable?" "What's going on?" Mark's voice had an edge now. Not quite alarm yet. More like the feeling before alarm when the body knows something the mind is still refusing. "The property at this address," Daniel Cross said, and he named it the full address, the legal parcel description, "is held in its entirety by the Whitmore Family Trust established in 2003. He produced a document, set it on the hall table beside his briefcase with the exactness of a surgeon laying down an instrument. Sarah Elaine Whitmore is the sole beneficiary and trustee of that instrument. She has been since her father amended the trust in 2009. Mark stared at the document. "I'm aware there's a trust structure," he said. "We've discussed that." "I'm sure you have," Daniel Cross said with a neutrality that was somehow worse than sarcasm. "However, I want to make certain you understand the specific terms. You have no ownership interest in this property. None. Your name has never appeared on the deed, the trust document, or any lien or mortgage instrument associated with this address because there is no mortgage. The property is owned free and clear by the trust." The coffee Mark had been drinking felt suddenly very far away. "I've been contributing to the operating costs." "A monthly maintenance contribution, yes, agreed upon informally at the outset of your marriage." Daniel Cross produced a second document. "That arrangement, Mr. Reynolds, constitutes tenancy, a permitted occupancy arrangement. It does not create ownership interest. It does not create equity. And it is, as of last night when Ms. Whitmore formally exercised her rights under the trust instrument, revoked." The word landed like a physical thing. "Revoked." "She what?" Mark said. "Your access to this property has been revoked, as of midnight last night. I'm here this morning as a professional courtesy to inform you of that directly, rather than through a sheriff's notice, which was the alternative available to Ms. Whitmore." Daniel Cross looked at him with the steady gaze of a man who has rehearsed none of this because he has done it enough times to not need rehearsal. "I'm also here to inform you that you are now considered an unauthorized occupant of this property." The word hit him differently. Unauthorized. He felt it move through him like cold water. "This is—" Mark started. He stopped. Started again. "This is absurd. We were married for 7 years. I lived in this house for 7 years. You can't simply—" "Mr. Reynolds." Daniel Cross's voice didn't raise. It didn't soften either. It simply remained exactly what it was. "Illinois law is quite clear on this. The property was never marital property. It was held in a separate trust predating your marriage. Your cohabitation does not create a legal interest. Your contribution to maintenance costs does not create a legal interest. And the formal dissolution of the marriage arrangement that occurred last night, initiated by you, removed the courtesy of permitted occupancy that Ms. Whitmore had been extending to you." Mark felt the floor, the actual physical floor, become uncertain under him. Not literally, but the sensation was physical. That specific feeling of a man who has been standing on something he believed was solid, discovering that it was and has always been suspended. "She can't do this," he said, And even as he said it, he heard himself, heard how it sounded. The echo of those exact words. She can't do this, reverberating off the walls of a house that had never been his. She has done it, Daniel Cross said simply. There was a silence in the entrance hall. The morning light came through the side windows. Somewhere outside, a car passed on Lakeview Drive. The world continued at its ordinary pace, indifferent to the total structural collapse happening inside the front hallway of 1847 Lakeview Drive. "How long do I have?" Mark asked. And the asking of it, the reduction of him in that moment to a man inquiring about how long before he must vacate, was the first real wound. Not the information, the question. "Ms. Whitmore has authorized a 72-hour window for you to remove your personal belongings, clothing, personal documents, items that are unambiguously yours and can be verified as pre-existing or individually purchased." Daniel Cross reached into the briefcase one more time and produced a final document, a formal notice printed on legal letterhead with Sarah's signature at the bottom, in the clean, unhurried hand of a woman who had never been unsure of who she was. "After 72 hours, we'll be arranging for the property to be formally secured, and any remaining items will be cataloged and held." Mark took the document. He looked at Sarah's signature. He had seen that signature thousands of times on birthday cards, on grocery lists, on the note she left him once on his pillow that he had never told anyone about because it would have required admitting that someone had known him that well. His hand was shaking slightly. He made it stop. "Is there anything else?" he asked, and his voice was very careful now, in the way that voices get careful when the person behind them is working very hard. "One more thing," Daniel Cross said, and he reached into the side pocket of his briefcase and produced something smaller, a business card not his own. "Ms. Whitmore asked me to leave you this, in case you have questions that require direct communication." He set it on the hall table. "She won't be answering her personal phone. That number goes to her attorney." Her attorney. Of course she had an attorney. She had a $12 million trust and a family with enough history to have needed an estate lawyer since 2003. And Mark had spent 7 years in this house without once stopping to understand what that meant. Daniel Cross closed his briefcase with a soft, definitive click. "I'll see myself out," he said, which was in itself a statement that he too was more at home in this entrance hall than the man standing in it. The front door closed. Mark stood alone in the entrance hall of a house that had never belonged to him. He stood there for what might have been 2 minutes or 10. He genuinely could not have said. Time was doing something strange, moving in a way that felt disconnected from its usual rhythm, the way it does in the immediate aftermath of a car accident before the pain registers and the brain catches up. Then he called Victoria. She answered on the second ring. "Good morning. Did the lawyer—" "I need you to come over," he said. "Right now. Something's happened." A pause. "What kind of something?" "The house, Victoria. The house isn't—" He stopped, made himself say it. "The house isn't mine." Another pause. Longer this time. "What do you mean it isn't yours?" "It's Sarah's. It's always been Sarah's. It's in a family trust. Her name, her trust, her property." Each sentence came out with the staccato quality of a man still assembling what he knows into something his brain will accept as real. "I have 72 hours to get my stuff out." Silence on the line. The kind of silence that has texture. "Victoria." "I'm here," she said. "Can you come?" Another pause, and this one told him something before she spoke. This pause had a quality he had not heard from her before. Calculation, reassessment, the sound of a mind reorganizing its models. "Mark," she said finally, "I have a 9 o'clock. I can't move. And I think you should probably handle this with your lawyer. I don't think it's appropriate for me to be—" "My lawyer," he repeated. "Victoria, I don't have a lawyer. I know this is a shock," she said. Her voice had shifted, still warm technically, but the warmth had the quality of something performed rather than felt. He could hear the difference, now could hear it in a way he hadn't been able to before, because before this morning he hadn't needed to hear it. "But this is really a legal matter, and honestly, me coming over to the property right now, given the circumstances, wouldn't look right." Wouldn't look right. He heard those words and felt something in his chest do something complicated. "You told me to do this," he said quietly. I encouraged you to be honest about what you wanted. That's different. Victoria. I have to go, Mark. I really do have a 9 o'clock. Get a lawyer. This is going to be okay. And then, because she was very good at what she did, I'll check in later. She hung up. He looked at the phone in his hand. The screen had gone dark. He could see his own reflection in it standing in the entrance hall, holding a phone in a suit he had put on that morning with the intention of going into the office and being the executive vice president of Hargrove Capital Management, a man at the apex of everything he had built. He looked in the dark screen of his phone like a stranger. The call to his office was harder to make than he expected. He told his assistant he'd be working from home that morning. A family matter would check in by noon. His assistant said, of course. He hung up. Sat down on the bottom step of the staircase, the grand staircase of the house that was not his, and put his head in his hands. This is the moment, perhaps, where some men find clarity, where the shock burns off and what's underneath is visible. Mark Reynolds sat on that step for a long time, and what he found underneath was not clarity exactly. It was something rawer than that. It was the specific, sickening retrospection of a man replaying 7 years of conversations and realizing how many of them he hadn't bothered to fully hear. He thought about the night early in their marriage when Sarah had tried to explain the trust to him, had sat him down at the kitchen table with a folder of documents, had started to walk him through the structure, and he had said, "Sarah, I trust you. I don't need to read all of this." He had meant it as a compliment, as evidence of his confidence in her, as the gesture of a man who was above the small details. She had looked at him for a moment. Then she had closed the folder. "Okay," she'd said. "Okay." He had never seen that folder again. He thought about the time 2 years in when a colleague had admired the house at one of their firm dinners, had said, "Mark, this place is extraordinary. You must be incredibly proud." And Mark had said, with the ease of a man who has been telling a version of truth for so long, it no longer registers as anything else. "We love it here." And Sarah, standing beside him with a glass of wine, had said nothing, just smiled. He had interpreted the smile as contentment, as a wife basking in the reflected light of her husband's social confidence. She had been something different, patient maybe, or simply private. Or maybe, and this was the thought that made the step underneath him feel very cold, maybe she had been watching him perform ownership of something that wasn't his, with the gentle, exhausted sadness of someone who has long since stopped expecting to be seen accurately. His phone rang. He looked at it. James Caldwell, his colleague, 12 years, the one he hadn't talked to about any of this because James would have said something inconvenient. He let it ring, then felt guilty and answered. "Hey," James said. "You coming in? There's a 9:30 with the Henderson account." I'm going to be late. Cover the opening." "Sure." A pause. James was good at pauses. They were rarely empty. "You okay?" "Fine," Mark said. "You don't sound fine." "James, I'm fine." "All right." James didn't believe him. Mark could hear that clearly. "You know where I am." He hung up. The 72 hours that followed were among the worst of Mark Reynolds' adult life, and he would later be unable to account for most of them in any coherent narrative. He moved through them in fragments. He packed. Not quickly, not with any kind of emotional organization, just mechanically room by room, with the dawning inventory of a man discovering how little of a shared life was actually his alone. The furniture was Sarah's family's. The art on the walls. 3 pieces he had always pointed out to guests as examples of his taste had been in the Whitmore collection for decades before he arrived. His clothes were his personal documents were his laptop, his watches, his few books. It fit ultimately into 4 boxes and 2 suitcases. 7 years. 4 boxes and 2 suitcases. He called his friend David, who had a spare room, and said he needed a few days. David, to his credit, did not ask many questions. He said, "Come." Mark went. He did not contact Victoria again that first day. He told himself it was because he was handling practical matters. He knew in the part of himself that was still honest that it was because he was afraid of what he would hear if he did. He called the next morning, not because things had changed, but because there is a specific human impulse in moments of total devastation to reach toward the thing you thought was solid, even when some part of you already suspects it won't hold. Victoria answered in her professional voice, not her personal one, the small distinction that told him everything. "Mark, "How are you managing?" "I've moved my things out," he said. "I wanted to talk about us, about going forward." A pause, long enough to be a sentence before she spoke. "Mark," her voice was careful, the way a surgeon is careful with something that needs to be cut. "I've been thinking about this since yesterday, and I want to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty." He waited. His heart was doing something he didn't have a word for. What we built together in terms of our working relationship and our connection was real. I want you to know that. Real. Past tense. He heard the tense before he registered the word. But I've also had to be honest with myself about what I want. And the situation you're in right now, legally, professionally with the house, it's complicated. And I have my career to think about, my reputation at the firm. Your reputation, he said. "I know that sounds cold. I'm not trying to be cold, but we never made anything official. And if this becomes public, and these things always become public, I can't afford to be seen as the reason a senior executive's marriage. You were part of the reason," he said with a quietness that was more damaging than volume. Another pause. "I encouraged you to follow what you wanted. That's different from being the cause." It was almost word for word what she had said the day before. He recognized it this time for what it was, a prepared statement. She had said it before because she had prepared it before. "Victoria," he said, "be straight with me. Are you done?" A pause that lasted 4 seconds exactly. He counted them. "I think," she said carefully, "that given everything, it's better if we give each other some space while you get things sorted out. Professionally, it's cleaner. And I do genuinely care about you, Mark, which is why I'm being honest." He understood. He had understood before she finished the first sentence. He was no longer the executive vice president of a prestigious firm who lived in a $12 million Lake Forest mansion. He was a man with 4 boxes and 2 suitcases in his friend's spare room, with a legal notice in his jacket pocket, and a divorce proceeding that was about to get significantly more complicated than he had anticipated. Victoria Lane had done the math, and the math no longer added up. "I understand," he said. "Mark," I said, "I understand, Victoria." He hung up. He sat in David's spare room on a bed that was not his, in a house that was not his, having just been released by a woman who had spent the better part of 18 months carefully convincing him to blow up his life, and felt for the first time since this had all started, something that was not ego, not calculation, not the performance of being Mark Reynolds' successful man at the apex of his achievements. He felt very simply like a fool. And below that feeling, below the shame and the anger and the hollow, ringing shock of consequence, something even quieter, something he didn't have a word for yet, but would spend a long time later trying to name. It was the specific grief of a man who has just realized that the person he spent 7 years not seeing clearly was the only person who had ever seen him completely. He thought about Sarah's face in the entrance hall of the library, the way she had set down her book so carefully. The way she had asked her one question, "Is there someone else?" and accepted his non-answer with the composure of a woman who had already known the truth and had been waiting not for confirmation, but for him to have the honesty to say it. He thought about what she'd said before she walked into the storm. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Mark. Not I hope you suffer, not you'll regret this, not even anger. Just that, generous to the end. Or perhaps not generous, perhaps simply certain." The words of a woman who walked out of her own house that night, not as someone who had lost something, but as someone who had decided she was finished carrying something that had grown too heavy to be worth it. He did not sleep that night. Not sleep. And in the morning his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, and when he answered it, he heard his supervisor's assistant's voice asking him if he could come in for a meeting with HR and the managing partners. That morning he found out that the story of his separation from his wife and the specific circumstances of his relationship with Victoria Lane had reached the wrong ears at Hargrove Capital Management. The kind of firm that manages the wealth of Chicago's elite cannot afford the association with a senior executive whose personal conduct has been, as the managing partner would put it, with the precise, bloodless language of institutional self-protection, inconsistent with the professional standards expected at this level. He was placed on administrative leave pending a full review. Victoria Lane had already submitted a formal statement clarifying the nature of their working relationship. He sat in his car in the parking garage of a building he had worked in for 11 years, holding his access badge, and understood that the review was a formality. You don't survive this kind of thing at a firm like Hargrove. Not in this city. Not when the wronged party is a Whitmore because the managing partner knew the Whitmore name. Of course he did. Everyone in Chicago wealth management knew the Whitmore name. Mark had simply never put together what it meant that he had been living with one. He drove back to David's spare room. 4 boxes, 2 suitcases, administrative leave, no house, no Victoria. 6 months earlier, he had been standing in the executive elevator of Hargrove Capital, telling himself he had built everything from nothing and arrived at the top. He had not built everything. He had been allowed to stand on something. And when he had done the one thing that required the permission to be withdrawn, the ground had simply gone. Not with drama, not with explosion. The way solid things actually collapse suddenly, completely, and without any possibility of pretending it hadn't happened. In Chicago on a Wednesday in March, Mark Reynolds sat in a borrowed room and finally, for the first time in a very long time, was completely alone with the truth of himself. And the truth was looking back at him without mercy. The administrative leave lasted 11 days before it became something permanent. Mark had spent those 11 days in David's spare room doing what men in crisis do when they cannot yet face the full dimension of what has happened. He worked the perimeter. He called employment lawyers. He reviewed his contract. He drafted, then deleted, then redrafted emails to the managing partners at Hargrove that he ultimately never sent because every version of them required him to explain himself. And he did not yet have an explanation that didn't collapse under its own weight the moment he looked at it honestly. James Caldwell called on the 4th day. Not his assistant, James himself, which meant it was not a routine call. "I heard," James said without preamble. "All of it." Mark was quiet for a moment. "How much is all of it?" "Enough." A pause. "The Victoria thing has been around the floor since Tuesday morning. And the house situation, Mark. You know how this building talks." "I know." "Is it true about the house?" Mark pressed the phone against his ear and looked at the wall of David's spare room. A framed print of a lighthouse. Someone else's decoration in someone else's house. "Yes," he said. "It's true." James exhaled, long and slow and with the specific weight of a man who wants to say, "I told you something was wrong," but never actually said it. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." "Have you talked to Sarah?" "No." "Are you going to—" "She has an attorney handling all communication." Another pause from James, the kind that said more than what came before it. "Mark, listen to me. Whatever is happening with the legal stuff, and you need a good lawyer, a real one, not just consultations, whatever is happening with that, you need to think about who you actually want to be on the other side of this. What does that mean? It means I've known you for 12 years, and I watched you change this past year into someone I didn't always recognize. And I didn't say anything because it wasn't my business. But it's my business now because you're in David's spare room, and I'm covering your client meetings, and the partners are doing a review." His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who has earned the right to say the hard thing. Think about who you want to be, man. That's all I'm saying. Mark didn't have an answer. He said he would call James back. He didn't for another 3 days. The formal termination came on a Thursday, 11 days after the administrative leave began. Not a meeting this time, his badge had already been collected. A phone call from HR, a letter to follow by courier, a reference to the firm's conduct policy, and a severance arrangement that was technically generous and practically humiliating because the number, however substantial, carried in it the clear message that they were paying to make him gone quietly. He sat with the phone in his hand after the call ended and did the math. The severance would sustain him for 8 or 9 months if he was careful. His savings were real. He had always been financially disciplined, which was, he recognized with a dark internal humor, the one legitimate thing he had actually built himself. He was not destitute. He was not ruined in any financial sense that would be visible from the outside. But reputation in Chicago's wealth management world is not a soft currency. It is infrastructure, and his had been demolished in under 2 weeks with the thoroughness of a professional demolition crew that knew exactly which walls were load-bearing. He made a call he had been putting off a headhunter he'd worked with years ago, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had placed him at Hargrove in the first place. She took his call. She was warm, professional, and honest in the way that people are when they like you personally, but are about to say something that helps neither of you. "Mark, I'm going to be real with you," she said about 4 minutes into the call. "Your trajectory before all of this was exceptional. I would have had 3 conversations for you this week without blinking. But right now, the way this has been characterized, the conduct question, the optics with the colleague firms at this level, are going to wait. Not forever. But you're going to need some distance from this before I can put you in front of the right people." "How much distance?" "6 months minimum, possibly a year. I know that's not what you want to hear." "It isn't," he said. "Use the time," she said. "Seriously, I've seen people come back from worse, but they came back different, not just with better talking points. Actually different." A pause. "Whatever happened, and I'm not asking figure out the real version of it, because the people I place at that level can always tell when a man is selling them a curated story versus when he actually understands what went wrong." He thanked her, hung up. "Actually different." He turned the phrase over. It had the quality of something that sounded simple until you tried to locate exactly what it meant. He thought about Victoria. He had not spoken to her since the call in David's spare room, and she had not reached out. He had seen her name once in an email thread that had been forwarded to him accidentally by a junior analyst, who quickly realized the mistake and sent a mortified retraction. In the thread, 2 lines enough, Victoria had referred to the situation with the measured detachment of someone who has mentally filed a chapter under closed. She had described the relationship as a miscommunication that had been addressed. That was the word she had used, miscommunication. He had stared at that word for a long time, miscommunication, as if 7 years of a marriage had been disrupted by a clerical error. As if he had not made dozens of conscious choices, one after another, each one building on the last to get to the place where he stood in a library on a stormy Tuesday night and told his wife to leave her own house. The specific grinding insight that was beginning to take shape in him was not comfortable. It was not the kind of insight that feels like progress. It was the kind that feels like standing in a room you've been in 1,000 times and suddenly seeing every crack in every wall simultaneously and understanding that you didn't just fail to notice them, you had actively been choosing not to look. He had been the architect of this, not Victoria. She had handed him a blueprint and told him it was liberation, but he had been the one who picked up the tools. He was the one who had looked at Sarah, patient, private, genuinely good Sarah, and decided she was the obstacle rather than the foundation. That thought, when it arrived with its full weight, was worse than the loss of the house, worse than the job, worse than Victoria's careful, bloodless withdrawal. The house was a $12 million mistake in real estate logic. The job was a reputational casualty of bad decisions. Victoria was a lesson in the difference between being seen and being used. But Sarah was something he had broken that had been worth more than all of it combined, and he had broken it on purpose, and he had told himself while doing it that he was being brave. 3 weeks after leaving the Lake Forest mansion, Mark Reynolds did something he hadn't done in a long time. He called his mother. His mother, Carol Reynolds, was 67 years old, still in Rockford, still in the house where he had grown up, and she had the particular quality of mothers who have watched their children become something complicated. She loved him without condition and saw him without illusion. She knew some of what had happened, not the details, but the shape of it. Mothers always know the shape of things. She really owned it, his mother said, when he had finished telling her the story, in the flat, stripped-down version he had gotten to after 3 weeks of repetition. "The whole thing," he said. "Always had." A pause. "And you never asked?" "No." "Because you assumed?" "Yes." Another pause. He could hear her breathing, could picture her at her kitchen table, the one with the crack along the left side, from when he had dropped a textbook on it at 14. "Mark," she said finally, "what did you think of Sarah before all of this, when you first fell in love with her?" The question caught him sideways. He hadn't expected it. "I thought she was the most genuinely good person I had ever met," he said, and saying it, he heard how much distance existed between that sentence and the way he had been treating her. "And then," his mother said, he didn't answer immediately, "and then I started measuring her against a different scale. Someone else's scale." Yes, his mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he would carry with him for a long time. Mark, your father, rest his soul, worked himself to the bone, his whole life trying to become something he saw in other men, and he never once stopped to look at what he already had. I'm not saying he was a bad man, he wasn't, but he spent 40 years reaching for something outside the house and never understood that the thing he was reaching for was already inside it. She paused. I raised you better than that. I thought I did. I think I still might have, but you're going to have to decide. He ended the call 20 minutes later and sat with what she had said in the same way you sit with something that has landed squarely in the center of something you already knew but couldn't articulate. The following week he found an apartment. Not a dramatic step down, but not a luxury building either. A clean, functional 2-bedroom in Lincoln Park, the kind of place that costs enough to be respectable and contains nothing to be proud of. He moved his 4 boxes and 2 suitcases into it and stood in the kitchen on his first night and made coffee and did not think about the Lake Forest kitchen where he had stood 6 weeks earlier. Because if he thought about it too directly, he would not be able to move. He had started seeing the therapist. Not voluntarily, David had suggested it with the careful firmness of a good friend who is trying to help someone who is not yet ready to be helped. The therapist, a man named Robert Galvin, who practiced out of a River North office and had the unshowy, attentive manner of someone who has learned that wisdom is mostly just careful listening, did not tell Mark what he was doing wrong. He asked questions. That was mostly all he did. He asked questions and waited. In the 4th session, he asked Mark, "When you think about your marriage, not the end of it, but the middle of it, what do you remember feeling?" Mark thought about it. Really thought. "Safe," he said finally, which surprised him as he said it. "I remember feeling safe, like she, like Sarah, knew who I was and wasn't going to change the deal on me." "And how did you respond to that feeling?" Mark looked at him. "I thought it meant she needed me." Robert Galvin nodded, said nothing. "She didn't need me," Mark said, the full dimension of it arriving as he spoke it. "She chose to be with me. That's completely different." "Yes," Robert Galvin said quietly. "It is." He was 6 weeks into the Lincoln Park apartment when he found out through James, who was carefully, loyally feeding him information without violating anything important, that Sarah had returned to the Lake Forest house, that she had hired a small staff, had done some renovation work she had apparently been planning for some time, and was living there with the unhurried manner of a woman who has come home rather than a woman who has won anything. He also found out through the same careful channel that the divorce proceedings were underway. Sarah's legal team had filed. The process, given the lack of shared property and the clear financial separation, was expected to be straightforward. Mark had engaged his own attorney, a good one finally, someone James had recommended who had reviewed the situation and told him with the diplomatic honesty of a professional who charges by the hour that his position in the divorce was what it was, and that contesting the property question would be both expensive and unsuccessful. "Is there anything she's asking for that I should be concerned about?" Mark had asked. His attorney had looked at him. "She's not asking for anything, Mr. Reynolds. That's what's unusual. No punitive claims, no damage demands beyond the settlement of the formal separation. Her team filed a clean dissolution." Mark had stared at him. Nothing. He thought about that for a long time afterward. He turned it over the way you turn over something you don't yet understand, but recognize as important. She had every instrument available to her, the property, the legal standing, the resources, the moral position. She could have pressed. She had chosen not to. He did not understand it yet. He would understand it later in the way that certain truths only become visible once you have done enough of the other kind of seeing. The divorce was finalized on a quiet Friday afternoon in May. His attorney called him with the news. He thanked her and hung up and sat at his kitchen table in the Lincoln Park apartment, the table he had bought himself from a furniture store for $400, the first piece of furniture he had ever bought himself, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not relief, not grief exactly, something more specific. The feeling of a door closing, not slammed, not wrenched off its hinges, just quietly finally shut. He thought about calling James. He thought about calling his mother. He didn't call either of them. He sat at the $400 table and drank coffee and let the Friday afternoon be what it was. The job search had begun cautiously through channels that were smaller than what he was used to. Not the top-tier firms. Patricia had been right about that, and he had accepted it with more equanimity than he had expected, which he chose to interpret as growth, though he was still not entirely sure. A boutique advisory firm in the West Loop had expressed interest through a second-degree connection. The role was senior but not executive. The compensation was real, but not dramatic. He was considering it with the specific, humbled seriousness of a man who has been recalibrated. And then 8 weeks after the divorce was finalized, he saw her. He had not planned it. He was walking through the lobby of a downtown building where he had a meeting with a financial attorney, and she was coming out of the elevator with 2 other women laughing at something one of them had said. Laughing the way Sarah laughed when she wasn't performing anything genuinely quietly with her whole face. She looked exactly like herself. This was the thing that struck him first. Not that she looked well, not that she looked free, but that she looked exactly like herself. The woman he had met at that charity auction 8 years ago. The woman in the simple navy dress who had stood apart from the performance and held a glass of sparkling water and asked real questions. She was wearing a dark coat and her hair was the same. She carried nothing ostentatious. She looked like a woman who has always known who she is and has not had to renegotiate that with anyone. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. There was no way to prevent it. They were 15 feet apart in a lobby, a collision of timing that neither of them had choreographed. The 2 women with her noticed the shift in her attention and professionally stepped aside the way people who work closely with someone learn to read the moments that belong only to them. Sarah and Mark stood facing each other in the lobby of a downtown Chicago building on a Tuesday morning in July, and for a moment that lasted long enough to be counted, neither of them said anything. "Mark," she said. Her voice was even. The composure of it was not cold. It was just settled. She had settled in the time since March into herself in a way that was visible even from across 15 feet of lobby floor. "Sarah," he said. His voice came out less steady than he intended. He cleared it. "I didn't know you'd be here." "I have a board meeting on 12, she said. Because of course she did. Of course she had a board meeting. He realized in that moment that he had never asked, not once in 7 years, what Sarah Whitmore did with her time, her resources, her capacity. He had assumed she was simply present in his life. He had never thought to ask what she was present in when he wasn't looking. "How are you?" he asked. It was inadequate. He knew it was inadequate. She looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, but with the clear, unguarded directness of someone who has done the work of processing something and has arrived on the other side of it. "I'm well," she said, genuinely. "Good," he said. And then because there was something in him that needed to say at least one real thing. "Sarah, I want you to know I understand now what I—" She held up one hand, gently, not cutting him off harshly, just stopping him before he could get to wherever that sentence was going. "Mark," she said, "you don't have to." "I want to." "I know you do," she said. "But this isn't the place, and honestly—" She paused, and something moved through her expression that was not cruelty and not gentleness either, but something more honest than both. "I've made my peace with it. I genuinely have. I don't need the apology for my sake." He looked at her. "Then why did you file clean no claims?" "Nothing. You could have—" "I know what I could have done," she said quietly. "I chose not to. Not because you deserved the kindness, because I didn't want to spend another year of my life in a courtroom arguing about the value of things with a man who never understood their value in the first place." The words landed in him the way precise things land, not like a blow, but like a key turning in a lock that has been stuck for a very long time. "I never tried to know you," he said. It was the sentence he had been circling for months, the center of gravity of everything that had happened. "I only saw what you gave me." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were clear. No tears, no anger. The look of a woman who has heard the truth arrive slightly too late and is choosing how to receive it. "That's right," she said, simply, without adornment. "That's right, Mark." Her phone vibrated. She glanced at it. "I have to go," she said. She put her phone in her pocket and looked at him one last time with the specific expression of a woman extending something that is not forgiveness, because forgiveness implies a debt being resolved, and she no longer experienced anything as a debt. It was something more like recognition, the last honest acknowledgement between two people who are finished. "Take care of yourself," she said. She meant it. She walked to the elevator. She did not look back. He stood in the lobby of the downtown Chicago building alone again, and understood something he had not understood even that morning when he had walked in. He had spent 7 years in a house with a woman who had offered him something real, not the house, not the money, not the family name, but the one thing that actually constitutes a foundation. She had offered him the chance to be fully known by someone who was still willing to stay, and he had used that offer as a floor to stand on while he reached for things that glittered. The elevator closed behind her. He walked out of the building into the July morning and stood on the sidewalk and let it all be exactly what it was. No revision, no accounting, no performance, just the truth finally with nothing in front of it. He walked back to his car that Tuesday morning and sat in it for a long time without starting the engine. The financial attorney meeting he had come downtown for, the one he had been preparing for since the previous Thursday, the one with the carefully organized folder of documents on the passenger seat, felt suddenly very far away. Not irrelevant, just distant, the way practical things go distant when something more fundamental has just happened to you. He had seen her. He had said the words he had been circling for 4 months, and she had received them with the composure of a woman who no longer needed them, which was, he understood now, the most complete verdict possible. Not anger, not residual pain that could be interpreted as connection, just the clean, settled response of someone who had already finished processing something that he was still only beginning to understand. He sat in the car and let that be what it was. Then he picked up his folder, got out of the car, and went to his meeting. Because that was the thing he was learning slowly, and without any dramatic announcement about the work of becoming actually different, rather than just differently positioned, it required showing up for the ordinary things, even when the larger thing inside you was still loud. The meeting with the financial attorney was about reestablishing his professional structure. A liability entity, some straightforward planning around his savings, the kind of foundational work that a man who has spent years at the top of someone else's institution needs to do when he is, for the first time, genuinely building something of his own. His attorney, a compact and precise man named Gerald Marsh, who wore suspenders unironically and billed with the efficiency of someone who respected both his time and his clients. Reviewed the documents Mark had brought, asked 14 questions in rapid succession, and told him at the end of the hour that his financial position was more defensible than he had probably been telling himself. "You're not starting over," Gerald said, putting the cap on his pen. "You're redirecting. There's a difference. Starting over means you lost the capital. You didn't lose the capital, you lost the position. The capital is yours, and it's real, and it's enough to build from if you're disciplined about it." "I'm disciplined about it," Mark said. Gerald looked at him over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who has heard that sentence from many people in many conditions. "Good," he said. "Then let's get the structure right and get you positioned." Mark left the meeting with a legal pad of notes and something he hadn't expected, a small, clear flicker of something that was not quite hope, but was in the same family. The sense that the ground, while different from what it had been, was at least ground. Real, verifiable belonging to him in a way that required no one's permission to sustain. He called James from the sidewalk. "Can we get lunch this week?" "Thursday," James said immediately. "Noon, you know where." They had been going to the same Italian place in the Loop for 11 years. Mark had not been there since before any of this started. He was there on Thursday at 12:02, and James was already at the table, and they ordered without menus, because 11 years means you know what you want before you sit down. James waited until they had their food before he said anything real. "You look better," he said. "Not great, but better than the last time I saw you." "The last time you saw me, I was on administrative leave." "That's what I mean." James cut his chicken. "Where are you at with the job situation?" Mark told him about the West Loop boutique firm, the conversations that had moved from initial interest to something more concrete over the past 3 weeks. A formal offer was likely by the end of the month, senior advisor rebuilt from a legitimate floor rather than a borrowed ceiling. James nodded slowly. "It's a good firm," he said. "Smaller than what you're used to." "I know. But the partners have a real reputation. Clean, no drama." "I know." James looked at him. "Is that intentional on your part, choosing clean?" Mark thought about how to answer that honestly. "I think I've had enough drama to last me for a while," he said. "And I think the size of the stage I'm standing on matters a lot less to me than it used to. I'm not sure that makes me wise. It might just make me tired. But either way, yes, intentional." James was quiet for a moment. "I ran into Daniel Howe last week," he said. Daniel Howe, the family law attorney. Mark had consulted the week before the storm. The one who had asked about the property documents that Mark had never pulled together. "He mentioned he'd spoken to you before everything happened." "He did." "He said you never came back with the documents." "I didn't." James put his fork down. He was looking at Mark with the directness of 12 years of actual friendship, the kind that doesn't perform. "Mark, if you had pulled those documents—" "I know," Mark said. "You would have known." "I know. You might have, knowing maybe you would have." "James," Mark's voice was quiet but clear. "I know what I would have had, the information. I would have had the information, but I don't think I would have treated it the right way. I don't think I was capable of that yet." He paused. "That's the part that's hardest to say out loud. It's not that I didn't have access to the truth. It's that I had arranged my whole life so that the truth wouldn't be inconvenient." James looked at him for a long moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "That's yeah." He picked up his fork again. "She was always exceptional, you know. Sarah, from the first time I met her, I thought this woman is exceptional, and Mark has absolutely no idea." "I know," Mark said. "I know that now." "She filed clean. No claims." "Yes." James shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in the specific admiration of a man who recognizes real class when he sees its aftermath. "That's a remarkable woman," he said. "She is," Mark said. "She always was." The formal offer from the West Loop firm came on a Friday at the end of July, 14 days after the lobby encounter. Mark read it twice, set it on the $400 table, and made himself sit with it for 24 hours before responding. Not because he was uncertain he had known he would accept it, but because he was practicing a new relationship with decisions. The habit of actually sitting inside a choice before committing to it, feeling its full weight rather than moving fast to escape the discomfort of uncertainty. He accepted on Saturday morning. Called his contact at the firm, a woman named Helen Strauss, managing partner, who had the forthright manner of someone who had built something real from the ground up and had no interest in pretending otherwise. She sounded genuinely pleased. "We're glad to have you," Helen said. "I want to be honest with you about the first 6 months. It's going to feel different from what you're used to. Smaller scope, different pace. Some people struggle with the adjustment." "I'm aware," Mark said. "Good. Others find it clarifying. We'll see which one you are." He started on the first Monday of August. He arrived on time, introduced himself to the team without the performance he would have used. At Hargrove, learned people's names and used them, and spent the first 3 weeks listening, more than talking, which was not something that had come naturally to him before, and was now something he was actively practicing. The way you practice a physical skill with attention, with correction, with the persistent effort of someone who understands the thing doesn't happen automatically. His office was smaller. His title was less resonant. His compensation was real, but not the number he had once told himself in mirrors. None of that did what he had expected it to do, which was to make him feel diminished. Instead, it did something stranger and more useful. It made him feel located. Like a man who knows what floor he's on, rather than performing a version of himself that has no fixed address. He kept seeing Robert Galvin on Wednesday afternoons. The therapy had shifted from crisis management to something more sustained, the slower, less dramatic work of understanding the patterns that had led him to the storm. Robert Galvin asked his careful questions and waited, and Mark answered them with increasing honesty, which was harder than the early sessions, because the early sessions had still contained the residue of his own self-defense. In one session in September, Robert asked him, "What did success mean to you? Not what you thought it meant. What did it actually mean functionally? What did it do for you?" Mark thought about it for a long time. "It meant I wasn't my father," he said finally. "And what did that mean? It meant I wasn't afraid, that I wasn't small, that I had won some argument that I started when I was 12 years old and never finished." Robert Galvin nodded. Was Sarah part of that argument? Mark looked at him. She was the person who made me feel like the argument didn't matter, he said slowly. When I was with her early on, I didn't feel like I was fighting. I felt like I could stop. He paused. And then, somehow I decided that meant she was holding me back, because the only frame I had for feeling still was losing. So you rejected the peace because you'd mistaken it for defeat. The sentence landed so precisely that Mark felt it physically. Yes, he said quietly. That's exactly what I did. Robert Galvin said nothing for a moment. Then, how does that feel to understand? Terrible, Mark said, and necessary. It was in October, 7 months after the night of the storm, 5 months after the divorce was finalized, that Mark received a formal notice from Daniel Cross's office. Not about the property, not about the marriage, a different matter. Sarah, through her attorney, had indicated that she would attend a brief formal mediation session required by a minor outstanding legal procedural item from the dissolution, a routine matter about one jointly held account from the early years of their marriage, a small amount almost symbolic. The mediation was scheduled for the following Thursday. Mark called his attorney. Is this normal? Not completely, his attorney said. Standard procedural step. Her team has proposed a 30-minute session with a neutral mediator. It's not adversarial. They want to close the last open item cleanly. Will she be there in person? That's what they've proposed, yes. Her and Daniel Cross. You and me. He sat with that for 3 days. Not anxious exactly, not the way he would have been 6 months ago, when everything was still raw and chaotic and loud inside him. More like the recognition that something significant was about to happen and that it deserved to be met with the fullness of his attention. He thought about the lobby, about her composed face, her clear eyes, the way she had stopped him before his apology and said, "I've made my peace with it." He thought about what it meant to be in a room with someone you had genuinely wronged, who had chosen not to weaponize it, and what you owed that person in terms of how you showed up. He decided he owed her the truth of who he was actually trying to become. Not as a performance, not as a bid for absolution, just as an honest accounting offered without expectation. The mediation was held on a Thursday morning in a conference room in the Loop. Neutral territory, a law firm neither of them had used for the divorce, a mediator named Catherine Briggs, who had the unhurried, seen-everything demeanor of a professional who has watched people navigate the end of things for 30 years and knows that the paperwork is never really what the room is about. Mark arrived first. He sat on one side of the table and arranged his documents and did not look at his phone because he was working on the habit of being present for the things that mattered rather than managing his distance from them. Sarah arrived at 9:02 with Daniel Cross. She was wearing a charcoal gray jacket, and she had her hair pulled back, and she looked the word that arrived in Mark's mind, unbidden and accurate, like a woman who is completely at home in herself. Not performing confidence, not broadcasting anything, just occupying herself with the settled certainty of someone who knows who she is. She sat across from him. She set her hands flat on the table. She looked at him with the same clear directness that had characterized every interaction since the night of the storm, and said in a voice that was neither warm nor cold, but simply real, "Hello, Mark." "Sarah," he said, "thank you for agreeing to this format." The mediator opened the session with the procedural language of someone moving through a familiar sequence, and they addressed the account 22 minutes of clean, efficient work that was entirely without conflict because Sarah's team had already prepared an equitable resolution, and Mark's attorney agreed with it on site. It was, as described, almost symbolic. A small number quickly settled, requiring only signature. But then Catherine Briggs said, as she gathered the signed documents, "Is there anything either of you would like to say before we close this out? This is the last formal proceeding between you. Sometimes people find that meaningful." There was a silence. Daniel Cross looked at Sarah. She looked at Mark. He had prepared nothing. He had decided deliberately not to prepare anything because the version of himself that prepared speeches had spent years in a room where he was the only audience. He spoke from what was actually in him. "I want to say something," he said. "And I want you to know that I don't expect anything in response to it. I'm not saying it to get something." He paused, made himself look at her directly the way he had so rarely looked at her when they were actually together. "I spent 7 years with you, and I treated you like a backdrop, like you were the setting of my story instead of a person in it. I saw what you gave me, and I never asked what it cost you, or what you were, or who you had been before I arrived." His voice stayed level. It cost him something to keep it level. "I threw you out of your own house in a storm, and I thought I was finally being decisive. I understand now that I was being the worst version of myself that I had spent my entire life building toward without knowing it." Sarah was looking at him. Her expression had shifted, not broken, not tearful, but something had moved in it, a recognition maybe. The particular expression of someone who is hearing the truth, said plainly for the first time. "I don't say this to ask for forgiveness," he continued. "I don't think I've earned the right to ask for that. I say it because you deserve to hear it said plainly, without strategy, without me managing how it lands." He stopped. "That's all." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Sarah said something he had not anticipated. Not the composed deflection of the lobby, not the clean professional closure of a woman who has already finished processing. Something more honest than either. "I knew who you were when I married you," she said. Her voice was quiet and clear. "I don't mean that as an accusation. I mean I saw the pattern, the way you measured everything, the way you'd built this whole architecture of achievement to prove something to yourself. I thought—" She paused, and for the first time since March, something moved across her face that had the quality of genuine vulnerability. Not weakness, her composure didn't break, but something real arrived in the room that had not been in the lobby or any of the legal communications. "I thought love would be enough to make the architecture unnecessary. I was wrong about that. That's my part of it." Mark stared at her. "You don't have a part in this," he said. "I do," she said simply. "Not the choices you made, those are yours. But I let you believe things about the house, about our life, because I was afraid that if you understood the full picture, you'd stay for the wrong reasons, or you'd feel managed. So I held things back. And in holding things back, I let a gap grow between the truth and what you were living in." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not saying this to balance the blame. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you just told me the truth plainly, and I think you deserve the same." It was the most she had said to him in a single exchange since before any of this started. The mediator, Catherine Briggs, had the professional grace to be very still. Mark felt something move through him that was not relief and not grief, but something that contained both and was larger than either. The specific sensation of two people finally occupying the same room truthfully, not to fix anything, not to recover anything, but just because the truth itself has a weight and a dignity that deserves to be present even when it arrives too late to change the ending. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, fully, without conditions. She nodded once. "I know you are," she said, and then with a quietness that was not closing a door, but acknowledging that the door had already closed. "I'm glad you found your way to that." They signed the final document. Daniel Cross collected the copies. Catherine Briggs thanked everyone for their professionalism. The procedural choreography of conclusion moved through its final steps with the efficient courtesy of a system designed to bring things to their proper end. At the door, Sarah turned back. She looked at Mark one last time, not with the finality of the lobby, not with the studied distance of their months of legal separation, with something more human than both. "The firm you joined," she said, "Helen Strauss's firm. She's good. She built that practice from nothing. Real work." A pause, the ghost of something that was not quite a smile, but was in its neighborhood. "You'll do better there than you think." He stared at her. "You know about—" "James and I have lunch sometimes," she said. "We always did. You knew that." He hadn't known that. He realized with the full sudden weight of it that there had been an entire geography of Sarah's life that he had never mapped, never asked about, never been curious enough to explore. James, the board meeting on 12, the renovation plans she had apparently been holding for years, the trust established in 2003, amended in 2009, governing a $12 million property that she had carried with the same casual discretion she carried everything else, because she had never needed it to define her. She walked out of the conference room. He stood at the door and watched her go down the hallway, and he understood finally completely, without any remaining architecture of ego, in the way what he had had. Not the house, not the name, not the social adjacency to something larger than himself. He had had a person, a real one, the kind that is genuinely rare, and he had spent 7 years looking over her shoulder at his own reflection. He walked back to his car. He drove to his Lincoln Park apartment. He sat at his $400 table and opened his laptop and began drafting the first piece of real financial analysis he had produced in months, a strategy paper for a client at the West Loop firm, careful and honest and entirely without the performance of his old authority. He worked until 8 in the evening. He ate dinner at his own table. He went to bed in his own apartment, in a bed that was his, in a life that was exactly the size it actually was. And for the first time since March, he slept without the architecture collapsing around him in the dark. The strategy paper he submitted to Helen Strauss on a Friday morning in October was 14 pages long and contained no performance whatsoever. That was the thing Helen noticed first before the analysis, before the specific recommendations, before the careful logic of the risk-adjusted framework he had built from scratch over 3 weeks of real work. She noticed the absence of performance. The paper did not announce itself. It did not position Mark Reynolds as the author in every paragraph, the way ambitious men write ambitious documents where the work is half argument and half autobiography. It was simply precise, honest, and more useful than anything the firm had received from a new senior advisor in years. She called him into her office on Monday. Helen Strauss was 54 years old and had built her firm over 22 years from a 2-person advisory shop in a River North walk-up to a respected 12-person practice with a client list that was smaller than Hargrove's and considerably more loyal. She was the kind of woman who had watched enough men perform competence to have developed an almost clinical sensitivity to the difference between the performance and the thing itself. She sat across from Mark with the paper on her desk and said without preamble, "This is excellent work." "Thank you," Mark said. "Not excellent for a first submission. Not excellent given the circumstances. Excellent full stop." She tapped the paper. "The emerging market repositioning argument on page 9, I want to take that to the Brennan account this week. Are you ready to present it?" "Yes," he said. "Good." She leaned back. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, not the way you think I want to hear it answered." "All right." "What changed," she said, "between the man who was at Hargrove 18 months ago and the man who wrote this paper?" "Something changed. I want to know what." He considered the question. The old version of him would have given her a curated answer, something about perspective and recalibration, and the value of adversity, the kind of language that sounds like insight but is actually armor. He gave her the real one instead. "I lost everything I thought I owned," he said, "and in losing it, I found out which parts of it were actually mine to begin with. The ones that were mine, the capacity for real work, the analytical discipline, the willingness to look at something honestly, those I still have. The ones that weren't mine." He paused. "I don't miss them the way I expected to." Helen looked at him for a long moment. "That's a hard thing to learn," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." "Most people don't learn it," she said. "They just find a new version of the same thing to hold on to." She stood, which meant the conversation was over, in the way that conversations in her office always ended efficiently, without ceremony, and with the implicit confidence that the important things had been said. "Brennan account, Thursday at 2. Be ready." He was ready. The Brennan presentation went well. Not in the theatrical way that Mark Reynolds' Hargrove EVP would have once defined a successful presentation, not with the room visibly impressed, not with compliments offered like currency. It went well in the quieter, more durable way that real work goes. Well, the clients asked hard questions. He answered them honestly, acknowledged 2 areas of genuine uncertainty, rather than papering over them with confident language. And by the end of the meeting, the Brennan family's senior trustee had said with the measured approval of someone who has dealt with enough financial advisors to know the difference between substance and salesmanship. "This is what we've been looking for, this kind of honesty." He drove back to the office afterward and sat at his desk, a real desk now his own smaller than the one at Hargrove, and felt something he recognized from very long ago. From before the promotions, and the salary numbers, and the Lake Forest mansion, and the silk ties, and all the elaborate machinery of being Mark Reynolds. He felt the specific satisfaction of having done the actual work well, not the satisfaction of being seen doing it, of actually doing it. It was, he realized, the same feeling he had chased as a scholarship kid at Northwestern, staying up past midnight in the library, because he genuinely loved the material before success had arrived and slowly replaced the love with its own hunger. He had not felt it in years. He had not noticed it was gone. He called his mother that evening. "The presentation went well," he said when she picked up. "Tell me about it," she said, and she meant it not as a social formula, but as an actual invitation. This was who Carol Reynolds was. She genuinely wanted to know. He told her. The full version, the one with the specifics, the one that required her to actually follow what he was describing. She asked 2 smart questions that surprised him because he had spent so many years treating her kitchen table wisdom as categorically different from his professional world. And sitting with her questions, now he understood that the categories had always been false. "You sound different," she said when he had finished. "I've been told that," he said. "Better different," she said. "Not easier, but better." "Yes," he agreed. "Are you happy?" she asked. The directness of it, the way she asked it, without apology for how simple it sounded, caught him briefly. He thought about it honestly. "Not yet," he said. "But I think I understand what happiness actually requires now, which is more than I knew 6 months ago. So that feels like progress." She was quiet for a moment. "That's enough," she said. "That's more than most people get." He believed her. November arrived with the particular cold that Chicago does better than almost anywhere. Not the dramatic cold of a city that occasionally gets winter, but the bone-certain cold of a place that takes it seriously, where the wind off the lake has genuine opinions, and the people who live there have made a kind of peace with being tested. Mark had always felt the Chicago winter as an inconvenience to be managed from inside heated buildings and chauffeured cars. He felt it differently now, walking to work from his Lincoln Park apartment, letting it be what it was. He had been at the West Loop firm for 3 months when James called on a Tuesday afternoon with a different quality in his voice, not the casual check-in tone, not the careful loyalty of a friend managing information, something with more weight. "I need to tell you something," James said, "and I want you to hear it without doing anything with it right away. Just hear it." Mark set down his pen. "Go ahead." "Victoria Lane resigned from Hargrove last week." He hadn't expected that. "Why?" "The review board finished their secondary conduct review. Apparently, her statement about the nature of your working relationship, the one she submitted in March, had some inconsistencies with communications that surfaced during the review. Emails mostly." A pause. Her statement characterized things as significantly more professional than the record supported. Mark was quiet for a moment. "She's gone. As of Friday. Clean resignation, no formal findings, but the partners made it clear the findings were coming." Another pause. "I'm not telling you this because I think you should do anything with it. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the full picture." "I'm not going to do anything with it," Mark said. "I know," James said. And then with the directness of someone who has been carrying something, "Mark, she was using you. I think you know that. I think you've known it for a while, but I want to say it plainly because I didn't say it when it would have mattered, and I've sat with that." "James, I'm serious. I should have said something. When I watched what was happening with you last year, the way you were changing the distance from Sarah, the whole thing, I should have said something. I told myself it wasn't my business. That's a coward's excuse, dressed up as respect." His voice had something raw in it that Mark had not heard from James before. "I'm sorry I didn't say it." Mark felt the weight of it. 12 years of friendship, the two of them navigating the complicated terrain of what you owe someone versus what you're allowed to say. "You couldn't have stopped it," he said finally. "I wasn't in a place to hear it. I know that." "Maybe," James said. "But I should have tried." "You're trying now," Mark said. A silence. Then James quieter. "How are you actually doing?" "Actually," Mark thought about it. "I'm building something real for the first time. It's smaller than what I had. It's entirely mine. Those two things feel connected." "Yeah," James said. "Yeah, they are." They talked for another 20 minutes about ordinary things, the Mark at James's Kids, a restaurant that had opened near the office, and when they hung up, Mark sat for a moment with the news about Victoria turning it over without the satisfaction he might have expected to feel, and didn't. What he felt instead was something simpler, the specific absence of bitterness. He had expected, if this moment ever came, to feel vindicated, proven right. The clean geometric satisfaction of consequence arriving where it belonged. He felt none of that. He felt only the quiet confirmation that actions have weight, that choices accumulate, and that the accounting eventually comes due for everyone, including him especially. He went back to work. The weeks between November and the new year passed with the productive steadiness of a man who has found his actual rhythm rather than performing someone else's tempo. He took on 3 new client accounts at Helen's firm, each of them built on referrals from the Brennan family, who had apparently told people exactly what they had told him. This is the kind of honesty we've been looking for. He worked with the focused engagement of someone who has rediscovered that the work itself is the thing, not the altitude of the platform it's performed on. Robert Galvin, in their December session, asked him, "What do you want the next 5 years to look like?" Mark thought about it without the old impulse to answer in terms of position or title or compensation. "I want to be good at what I do and honest about what I don't know," he said. "I want to build something that's actually mine, not borrowed, not performed, and I want—" He stopped. "Go on," Robert said. "I want to be the kind of person someone can actually know," he said. "Not manage. Know." He paused. "I wasn't that person for a long time. I think I could be." Robert Galvin nodded slowly. "What would that require?" "Staying uncomfortable," Mark said. "Not running to the next version of the story when the current one gets hard. Actually, being in the room I'm in." He looked at Robert. "That sounds simple." "The simple things," Robert said, "are almost never easy." The new year came. Mark took his mother to dinner in Rockford on New Year's Eve, drove up himself. No occasion, no announcement, just showed up at her door at 6 p.m. with a reservation at a restaurant she had always wanted to try. She opened the door and looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a mother reading something in her son's face that she has been waiting to see for years. "You look like yourself," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. They had dinner for 3 hours and talked about everything. His father, her garden, his work, a trip she was planning to visit her sister in Tucson, the specific question of whether the Bears would ever sort themselves out, which they decided was probably not resolvable in either of their lifetimes. He drove home at midnight with the windows cracked and the radio on and the cold coming in off the highway, and felt genuinely, without performance, that the year ahead of him was a thing he was moving toward rather than fleeing from. It was in February, 14 months after the night of the storm, that the thing happened that he had not anticipated and was not prepared for, and which would be in the accounting of his life the most important moment of the entire aftermath. He received an email from Daniel Cross's office, not adversarial, not legal, short professional, and completely unexpected. "Ms. Whitmore has asked me to forward the attached document to you. No further action is required on your part." He stared at the email for a full minute before he opened the attachment. It was a letter, handwritten, scanned, 3 pages in Sarah's clean, unhurried handwriting, the same hand he had seen on the mediation documents, the same hand that had signed the divorce papers, the same hand that had left notes on his pillow in a life that felt from this distance like something that had happened to a different person. He read it at his desk in the West Loop office with his door closed, and he read it 3 times because the first time he read it, he was not capable of receiving all of it simultaneously. She had written it, she said at the beginning, not because she owed it to him, and not because she needed anything from him. She had written it because she believed in saying the full true thing when there was still an opportunity to say it, and because the mediation had opened something she had not expected, not a reopening of what was over, but a recognition that there were true things still unsaid, and that leaving them unsaid was its own kind of cost. She wrote about their early years, the specific things she had loved about him, not the achievements, not the ambition, but the version of him that emerged sometimes late at night when the performance fell away. The way he talked about his parents without realizing he was being tender, the way he read on Sunday mornings, The way he had once, 2 years into their marriage, stayed up until 3 in the morning with her neighbor's teenage son who was having a crisis, sitting at their kitchen table talking to the boy with a patience and genuine care that had surprised her and moved her and reminded her of why she had chosen him. She wrote about the distance, not as an accusation, as an honest account. The specific loneliness of being in the same house as someone who has stopped looking at you. The way she had tried quietly and then less quietly to reach him, and the way she had eventually understood that she could not reach someone who had decided below the level of conscious acknowledgement that he had already arrived somewhere she wasn't. She wrote, "I want you to know that I don't think you are a bad man. I think you are a man who was afraid of being small and built so many things around that fear that you eventually couldn't see past the walls. I think the man at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning with a frightened teenager was the real version of you. I think that man is still in there. I think from what James has told me, and from what I saw in that conference room in October, I think you are finding your way back to him. I'm glad of that, genuinely." She wrote about the house. She confirmed what he already knew legally, but added what he hadn't known, that she had always intended to tell him the full picture, that she had drafted the conversation several times in the first year of their marriage and kept pulling back, afraid of what it would do to the dynamic, afraid of the things she had described at the mediation, that he would stay for the wrong reasons. She wrote, "That was my failure of faith, not in you, in us. I should have trusted that a real thing could hold the weight of a real truth. I chose protection over honesty, and that choice had consequences. I own that. The last page was the shortest. She wrote, "I'm well. I'm doing the work I was always meant to do. The foundation is active again. We've funded 3 programs this year that I'm proud of. The house is full of the right things now. I'm not lonely. I want you to have what you want too, Mark. Not the version of it you were performing, the actual thing. The thing that's yours. I think you're getting there. Take care of yourself. That's all." She had not signed it with her married name. She had signed it Sarah Whitmore, the name she had always been the name she would carry forward into everything she had always been heading toward. He sat at his desk with the letter in his hands for a very long time. He did not cry, or not exactly. Something happened in his face that was in the same territory as tears, but was more than grief and less than relief. The specific physical response of a person receiving the full, accurate truth of themselves from someone who had known them better than they had known themselves, offered without cruelty and without softness, just with the clean, dignified honesty of someone who has nothing left to protect. He read the part about the teenage boy 3 times. He had almost forgotten that night. He remembered it now with a completeness that surprised him. The boy's name was Tyler. He was 16. Something had happened at school, some crisis of the kind that feels to a 16-year-old like the end of everything. And Mark had sat with him because it had mattered to him, because something in Tyler's specific fear had resonated with something in his own history. And he had stayed up until 3 because the boy needed someone to stay. Sarah had seen that, had held on to it, had named it 14 months after the end of their marriage as evidence of who he actually was. He put the letter in his desk drawer, not in a file, not processed and cataloged, just in the drawer the way you keep something that you want to be able to reach when you need to remember something true about yourself. He called his mother that evening, not to tell her about the letter, not yet, just to hear her voice. She picked up on the second ring, and before he could say anything, she said, "I was thinking about you today." "Good thoughts?" he asked. "Always," she said. He smiled. It was the real kind, the kind that happens before you decide to smile, the kind that means something. Spring came to Chicago in March with the particular sense of reprieve that follows a Chicago winter sudden and generous and smelling of Lake Michigan and new starts. Mark walked to work through it with his coat open because the cold that remained was the pleasant kind, the kind that reminds you you're alive without punishing you for noticing. He was 14 months after the night of the storm, a man who had lost the house he thought was his, the job he thought defined him, the woman he thought reflected him, and the version of himself he had spent 39 years constructing with the relentless discipline of someone escaping something. He had not replaced them with equivalent things. He had replaced them with smaller, truer things. An apartment that was his, a job that was his, a practice of honesty that was still imperfect and still ongoing and still required daily effort, but was his. A mother he called twice a week, a friend who had earned the right to say hard things and proved it, A therapist whose questions had opened rooms in him he had not known were locked. He had not replaced Sarah. He understood with the clarity that comes from the kind of work he had done over the past year that she was not replaceable. Not because she was mythologized in his memory, but because what she had offered was not a product available in the market of people. What she had offered was genuine knowing, the willingness to see someone fully and stay. And the fact that he had not been ready to receive it was the defining truth of who he had been and the beginning of who he was trying to become. The Whitmore Family Foundation, he had found out through an article in a Chicago philanthropy publication that James had forwarded without comment, had just announced a $7 million initiative for early childhood education in underserved Cook County communities. Sarah was listed as the foundation's executive director. Her photograph accompanied the article, professional, unassuming, exactly like herself. She was smiling in the way she smiled when she wasn't performing anything. He read the article once. He did not send a message. He did not reach out through any channel. He simply noted with the complete and undramatic acknowledgement of a man who has learned the difference between connection and interference, that she was doing what she had always been built to do. That the work she was doing was real and significant and entirely consistent with who she had always been with or without his witness. He closed the browser tab and went back to his own work. That afternoon, Helen Strauss knocked on his open office door. She never made appointments for the things that mattered, a quality he had come to appreciate deeply, and said, "I want to talk to you about a partnership track." He looked up from his desk. "We've been building toward this conversation since October," she said, sitting down in the chair across from him with the ease of someone who has already made a decision and is now delivering it. "The Brennan referrals, the work on the Henderson restructuring the Okafor account. You've built real trust here in 8 months, which is faster than anyone we've brought in at this level." She looked at him steadily. "I want to know if you're in this for the long term. Not the title. I don't particularly care about the title question. I care about whether this is where you're actually pointing yourself." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "this is where I'm pointing myself." "Why?" she asked. "And don't tell me it's about the work quality or the client relationships. Those are true, but they're not the answer. Why here?" He thought about it for a moment. "Because what you built here is real," he said. "Because the foundation of it is honesty and long-term relationships and actual service to clients, rather than the performance of service. Because I spent a long time confusing the size of the platform with the quality of the work, and I can't make that confusion anymore. I don't want to." He paused. "And because I have a specific skill that I spent years using for the wrong reasons, and I'd like to spend the next 20 years using it for the right ones." Helen Strauss was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once with the brisk finality of a woman who recognizes a straight answer when she hears one. "Good," she said. She stood up. "We'll have the partnership conversation formally in June. Make sure the Okafor analysis is done by the 15th. She left. He turned back to his desk. Outside the window, Chicago was doing what it does in spring, being loud and alive and completely indifferent to any individual story playing out within it. The way great cities are, the way life is, the way truth is. It does not pause for your reckoning. It does not soften the consequence. It does not rewrite the ending because you have finally understood the lesson. It simply continues and offers you, if you are paying attention, if you have done the work of becoming someone capable of receiving it, the next real moment. Mark Reynolds was 40 years old. He had 400 square feet of apartment. He genuinely owned a $400 table he had chosen himself. A drawer that held a letter from the truest person he had ever known. A mother who said, always when he asked if she was thinking good thoughts. A friend who had finally said the hard thing, and a partnership conversation scheduled for June. He had none of the things he had once stood in his own bathroom mirror to prove to himself. He had something that could not be taken away through trust documents or firm reviews or the cold calculations of a person who had decided he was no longer useful. He had the truth of himself arrived at through the wreckage of everything false. And that finally, completely without anyone's permission and at no one's sufferance, was entirely his own. Sonnet 4.6, Low.